The cabin sat at the edge of the settlement, and every farmer who passed it had an opinion. Most of those opinions weren't kind. They called it the grass house. Some called it the fool's palace. A few called Heinrich Zimmermann, the man who built it, worse things than that. What bothered them most wasn't just that the walls were stuffed with prairie grass, it was that he claimed those walls. Those ridiculous grass-stuffed walls would keep his cabin at 72 degrees Fahrenheit without burning a single stick of firewood. That was impossible. Everyone knew it. You needed fire to stay warm in a Nebraska winter. That was a fact as solid as the frozen ground. Heinrich's claims weren't just wrong, they were dangerous. What if some greenhorn believed him and froze to death trying to copy his foolish ideas? What if his own family paid the price for his arrogance? The mockery started in the spring of 1876 when Heinrich first explained his plans to his neighbors. He was a German immigrant, 41 years old, who'd arrived in Nebraska 3 years prior with his wife Greta and their 4 children. He'd worked as a stonemason in Bavaria and had spent 2 years working on buildings in New York before heading west. He had money saved, enough to buy good land and build properly. But properly, in Heinrich's mind, meant something entirely different than what his neighbors understood. The Zimmermann family had spent their first 2 Nebraska winters in a standard sod house, like most settlers in the area where timber was scarce. The sod house had worked, barely. It leaked. It was dark. It was damp. The earthen walls provided decent insulation, but the roof was a constant problem, and the interior was depressing. Heinrich had used those 2 winters to observe, to think, and to plan. He'd noticed things that other settlers seemed to ignore. He noticed that the south-facing wall of the sod house, the one that caught the winter sun, was always noticeably warmer than the other walls. He noticed that on sunny winter days, even when the outside temperature was well below freezing, the interior could become uncomfortably warm if the door was kept closed. He noticed that the thick sod walls held heat for hours after the sun had set. These observations formed the foundation of an idea. What if he could build a structure that captured the sun's heat during the day and stored it for use at night? What if the walls could be insulated so well that almost no heat escaped? What if the entire building could function as a heat battery, charged by the sun, maintaining a stable temperature without any fire at all? The idea wasn't entirely original. Heinrich had read about similar concepts in a German engineering journal years before. He'd read about French experiments with solar heating and English designs for conservatories that stayed warm through winter. But no one, as far as he knew, had combined these principles into a practical frontier cabin. No one had tried to build a home that could maintain human comfort temperatures in a Nebraska winter without firewood. When he explained his plan to his neighbor, John Peterson, the reaction was immediate and predictable. Peterson, a Swede who'd been in Nebraska for 8 years, laughed outright. "You're going to heat your house with sunshine? In Nebraska? In winter?" "Heinrich, I respect you, but that's the craziest thing I've ever heard." Heinrich remained calm. "Not with sunshine alone. With sunshine stored in mass, the building will collect heat during sunny days and hold it through the nights and cloudy days." Peterson shook his head. "And what happens when we get a week of clouds? A month of storms? You going to freeze your family because you're too stubborn to build a fireplace?" "There will be a fireplace," Heinrich said, "as backup. But if I build correctly, I won't need it. The structure itself will maintain temperature." Peterson wasn't the only skeptic. The entire settlement thought Heinrich had lost his mind. When he started hauling stones for the foundation in May of 1876, the comments began in earnest. The foundation Heinrich laid was massive. He dug down 3 feet below the frost line and filled the trench with carefully fitted stones, mortared with a mixture of clay, sand, and lime. The foundation walls extended 2 feet above ground level, creating a raised platform for the cabin. This platform would prevent ground moisture from wicking into the walls and would help protect the structure from snow accumulation. The foundation alone took Heinrich 6 weeks to complete, working from dawn to dusk. His neighbors, who could throw up a sod house in 2 weeks, couldn't understand the delay. The cabin's footprint was 18 feet by 24 feet, larger than most settler cabins. The long axis ran east to west, with the south-facing wall being the 18-foot side. This orientation was critical to Heinrich's design. Maximum southern exposure meant maximum solar gain during the winter months when the sun tracked low across the southern sky. The first course of the wall structure surprised everyone. Heinrich built the south wall, the one facing the sun, with stone. Not sod, not wood, but stone. He built it 3 feet thick, using the same careful mortaring technique he'd used on the foundation. This wall rose 6 feet high, with 3 small windows, each 2 feet wide and 3 feet tall, positioned to catch the low winter sun. The windows were set into deep reveals, the thick wall creating a tunnel effect that would shade the glass during summer when the sun was high, but allow full sun penetration during winter. But the real controversy came with the other 3 walls. For the north, east, and west walls, Heinrich built a double-wall system that made every observer shake their heads in disbelief. He started with an inner wall of sod blocks, 2 feet thick, built just like a standard sod house wall. Then, 3 feet outside this inner wall, he built an outer wall, also of sod blocks, also 2 feet thick. This created a 3-foot cavity between the 2 walls. And into this cavity, Heinrich stuffed prairie grass, not just any grass and not stuffed randomly. He had spent the summer of 1875, during his second year in Nebraska, harvesting and preparing specific grasses for this purpose. He cut big bluestem and Indian grass, the tall prairie grasses that could grow 8 feet high. He cut them in late summer after they'd gone to seed but before the autumn rains. He bundled them loosely and stored them in a covered area where air could circulate, allowing them to dry thoroughly. By spring of 1876, he had several tons of dried grass, thoroughly cured and as dry as tinder. The dried grass was stuffed into the cavity between the walls in a specific way. Heinrich didn't just shove it in randomly. He built wooden frames, simple rectangular boxes made from scrap lumber, each frame 2 feet by 2 feet and 3 feet deep. He would fill a frame with grass, packing it firmly but not too tightly, then slide the entire frame into the wall cavity. The frames kept the grass from settling or compacting over time, maintaining the air pockets within the grass that provided the insulation. This process was slow and meticulous. Each wall section required careful fitting of the frames, ensuring no gaps existed where air could circulate. Heinrich understood that the enemy of insulation was air movement. Still air insulates. Moving air conducts heat away. His grass-filled frames created thousands of tiny, still air pockets trapped within and around the grass stems. These air pockets would resist heat transfer far better than solid materials. The neighbors who watched this process were baffled and amused. John Peterson visited regularly, not to help, but to express his ongoing amazement at Heinrich's folly. "You're building walls 7 feet thick." 7 feet. Do you understand how much floor space you're losing to those walls? Do you understand how much work you're doing for nothing? Heinrich would smile and continue working. The work is not for nothing. The grass is free. The sod is free. The labor is mine to spend as I choose. But it's wasted labor, Peterson insisted. Those grass walls might keep mice warm, but they won't keep your family warm. When winter comes and you're freezing, don't come crying to me for firewood. Heinrich just nodded and kept working. By late July, the walls were complete. The structure looked bizarre, squatting on its stone foundation with its massive south wall and its impossibly thick side and rear walls. The roof design added to the strangeness. Heinrich built a shallow-pitched roof, unusual for Nebraska where steep roofs helped shed snow. But Heinrich wasn't worried about snow load. His roof was designed for something else entirely. The roof structure consisted of heavy beams running east to west, spanning the 18-foot width of the cabin. On top of these beams, Heinrich laid thick planks, edge to edge, creating a solid wood ceiling. On top of the planks, he spread a layer of clay mixed with sand and straw, 6 inches thick. On top of the clay, he placed sod blocks, grass side up, creating a living roof of prairie grass. The total thickness of the roof assembly was approximately 1 foot, and it weighed several tons. This massive roof served multiple purposes. It provided insulation, preventing heat from escaping through the top of the structure. It added thermal mass, absorbing heat during the day and releasing it slowly at night. It protected the cabin from summer sun, preventing overheating. And it was nearly fireproof, an important consideration on the prairie where grass fires were common. But the most important feature of the building was something visitors couldn't see. It was the 6 tons of stone inside the cabin. Heinrich had built the south wall, the stone wall facing the sun, to extend into the cabin's interior. The wall didn't stop at the inside surface. It continued inward, creating a 3-foot-thick stone mass inside the living space. This interior stone wall was the heart of his design. It was a heat battery. During sunny winter days, sunlight would stream through the south-facing windows and strike this stone wall. The dark stone, which Heinrich had deliberately left unpainted, would absorb the sun's energy, heating up over the course of the day. The stone would continue absorbing heat as long as the sun shone on it. Then, after sunset, as the cabin's air temperature began to drop, the heated stone would radiate that stored warmth back into the living space. Stone has high thermal mass. It takes a lot of energy to heat stone, but once heated, stone releases that energy slowly over many hours. Heinrich calculated, based on rough estimates, that his 6 tons of stone, heated to a surface temperature of 90 degrees Fahrenheit by a sunny winter day, would continue radiating meaningful heat for 12 to 16 hours as it cooled back down to ambient temperature. The floor added additional thermal mass. Instead of wood or packed earth, Heinrich laid a floor of flat stones, mortared together and smoothed. This stone floor, directly exposed to the sunlight coming through the south windows, would also heat up during the day and radiate warmth at night. The total thermal mass inside the cabin, stone walls and floor combined, was approximately 8 tons. By late August, the cabin was finished. Heinrich moved his family in, and the neighbors waited for reality to teach him a lesson. The first test came not in winter, but in September. Nebraska summers are brutal, with temperatures frequently exceeding 95 degrees Fahrenheit. The settlers in their thin-walled cabins and sod houses suffered through the heat, sleeping outside when they could, enduring sticky, miserable nights when they couldn't. Heinrich's cabin remained cool during the hottest days of September, when outside temperatures reached 98 degrees. The interior of the cabin stayed at 74 degrees. The massive walls, thick enough to resist heat penetration from outside, kept the interior comfortable. At night, Heinrich would open the north and south windows, creating cross-ventilation that flushed out any accumulated heat and brought in the cooler night air. By morning, the cabin's interior was pleasantly cool, and it would stay that way through the next hot day. The neighbors noticed. Peterson visited on a particularly hot afternoon and was shocked by the temperature difference. He stepped inside and felt the coolness immediately. It was like stepping into a root cellar, except the cabin was fully above ground. "How are you doing this?" Peterson asked. Heinrich explained the principle. The thick walls prevent heat from entering during the day. At night, I open the windows and let the cool air in. The stone walls and floor absorb that coolness, and during the next day, they release it, helping to keep the interior cool. Peterson was impressed despite himself. "All right, so it works in summer, but winter is the real test. Let's see how well your grass walls work when it's 20 below outside." Heinrich just smiled. "We'll see." The real test began in November of 1876. The first cold snap arrived early that year, with temperatures dropping to 15 degrees Fahrenheit in mid-November. Most settlers had already fired up their stoves and fireplaces, burning precious firewood or twisted hay to stay warm. Heinrich did not light his fireplace. On November 15th, a clear, cold day with bright sunshine, Peterson stopped by to check on the Zimmermans, half expecting to find them huddled in blankets, shivering. Instead, he found Heinrich in shirt sleeves, working on a woodworking project inside the cabin. The children were playing on the floor, also dressed lightly. The cabin was warm. Peterson was stunned. He asked to borrow a thermometer, and Heinrich handed him one. The reading showed 68 degrees Fahrenheit inside, while outside it was 18 degrees. "How?" Peterson asked simply. Heinrich walked him through the cabin, explaining as they went. "The sun today has been shining since dawn. You see how the light comes through these south windows? It hits the stone wall directly. Put your hand on the wall." Peterson did. The stone was warm, noticeably warm. That stone has been absorbing heat from the sun all day. It will continue to release that heat all night. By morning, the wall will be cooler, maybe 60 degrees. Then tomorrow, if the sun shines again, it will heat back up. As long as we get sun every few days, the stone never fully cools down. It stays warm enough to keep the cabin comfortable. "But what about the walls?" Peterson asked. "What's stopping the heat from escaping through all that grass?" Heinrich smiled. "The grass stops it. Grass is mostly air. Air is an excellent insulator when it's not moving. My walls are 7 feet of trapped air, held in place by the grass stems and the sod. Heat cannot conduct through that quickly. The heat stays inside." Peterson shook his head slowly. "If I hadn't felt it myself, I wouldn't believe it." "You're really going to make it through winter without firewood?" "We'll see," Heinrich said. "But I believe so." The truly cold weather arrived in January of 1877. A series of blizzards hit Nebraska, dropping temperatures to 25 below zero. The wind howled for days. Snow piled in massive drifts. Settlers burned through their firewood at an alarming rate, and some families began burning furniture and parts of their own buildings just to stay warm. Heinrich's cabin stood firm. The thick walls completely blocked the wind. No draft penetrated the interior. The small windows, triple glazed with an air gap between each pane, another of Heinrich's innovations, prevented heat loss while still allowing sunlight to enter. The massive stone walls, heated during occasional clear days, held their warmth for 2 and 3 days at a time, slowly releasing stored energy into the living space. On January 20th, during the worst of the cold, Peterson and several other neighbors made a journey through the snow to check on the Zimmermans. They were genuinely worried. No smoke came from Heinrich's chimney. In this weather, that should mean death. They knocked urgently on the door, expecting the worst. Heinrich opened the door, again in shirt sleeves, and welcomed them in from the cold. The interior temperature was 70 degrees Fahrenheit. The stone wall was still warm to the touch. The children were playing a board game on the floor. Greta was baking bread, using a small oven that was heated by burning coal, not for cabin heat, but just for cooking. The neighbors stood in shocked silence. Finally, Peterson spoke. "It's 27 below outside. You have no fire." "How in God's name is this cabin 70 degrees? Heinrich explained patiently. "We had sun 3 days ago, a full sunny day. The stone absorbed heat from dawn to dusk. Since then, it has been releasing that heat slowly. The walls prevent the heat from escaping, so the stone cools very slowly, maybe 2 or 3 degrees per day. It's still radiating warmth. If we get another sunny day in the next 2 days, it will heat back up. If we don't, then yes, I'll need to light a fire. But so far, I haven't needed one." One of the neighbors, a young man named Thomas Wright, asked the question everyone was thinking. "But you're not using any fuel. How can you stay warm without burning fuel?" "You are burning fuel," Heinrich said. "You're burning the sun. The sun is a fire, 93 million miles away, and its energy reaches Earth every day. I've simply built a trap for that energy, a way to catch it, store it, and use it. My fuel costs nothing, and it will never run out." The implications slowly dawned on the gathered settlers. If Heinrich's design worked, and clearly it did, Then the entire logic of frontier survival needed rethinking. The endless labor of cutting and hauling firewood, the danger of running out of fuel in midwinter, the constant tending of fires, all of it could potentially be eliminated with the right building design. Wright spoke again. "Heinrich, do you understand what this means? If we all built like this, we'd save hundreds of hours of labor every winter. We'd save money. We'd be safer." Heinrich nodded. "Yes. This is why I built it. Not to prove I was clever, but to show it could be done, so others could learn and build better." The story spread rapidly through the Nebraska settlements. The German who heated his house with grass walls and sunshine, the cabin that stayed warm with no fire. Settlers from miles around came to see it for themselves, to touch the warm stone walls, to measure the temperature, to try to understand the principles. Not everyone was convinced. Some dismissed it as a trick or a fluke. Some claimed Heinrich must be secretly burning fuel when no one was watching. Some said it would only work in mild winters, and the next severe winter would prove them right. But Heinrich's cabin continued performing. Through January, February, and March of 1877, the cabin maintained interior temperatures between 65 and 72 degrees Fahrenheit. Heinrich lit his fireplace exactly 5 times that winter, on prolonged cloudy periods when the stone had cooled too much. Each time, a small fire for just 2 hours was enough to bring the temperature back up, after which the thermal mass would carry the cabin for several more days. By Heinrich's calculation, he burned approximately 1/10 the firewood that his neighbors used. The savings in labor, time, and fuel were enormous. But more importantly, his family was comfortable. They didn't suffer through the cold. They didn't worry about running out of firewood. They lived in stable, pleasant conditions all winter long. When spring arrived, Heinrich was visited by a delegation of settlers who wanted to learn his techniques. He spent days explaining the principles, showing them his drawings and calculations, helping them understand thermal mass, insulation, solar gain, and heat storage. Several families built new cabins in the summer of 1877, incorporating Heinrich's ideas. Not all of them went as far as Heinrich had. Most built less massive stone walls, thinner grass-stuffed cavities, and kept their fireplaces as primary heat sources. But even these partial implementations showed dramatic improvements. The cabins stayed warmer with less fuel. The families were more comfortable. The labor savings were significant. One settler, a man named Daniel Cooper, built a cabin that closely followed Heinrich's design. Cooper was a careful man, a former schoolteacher who understood the value of proven methods. He replicated the thick, south-facing stone wall, the grass-stuffed double walls au saut, the other 3 sides, the heavy roof, and the stone floor. In the winter of 1877 to 1878, Cooper's cabin performed almost as well as Heinrich's. Cooper burned even less firewood than Heinrich, perhaps because he had fewer people in his cabin generating body heat and using hot water, but the success stories also came with failures. Some settlers tried to copy Heinrich's design but didn't understand the principles. They built thin stone walls without enough thermal mass. They stuffed their wall cavities with green grass that rotted and smelled. They positioned their cabins facing the wrong direction, or built them in shaded locations where the winter sun couldn't reach. These poorly executed copies didn't work, and the failures gave ammunition to the skeptics who insisted the whole idea was nonsense. Heinrich tried to help where he could. He visited building sites, offered advice, corrected mistakes, but he couldn't be everywhere, and some people were too proud to ask for help. The result was a mixed landscape of buildings, some that worked brilliantly, some that worked adequately, and some that failed completely. The scientific community eventually took notice. In 1879, an engineer from the Department of Agriculture visited Heinrich's cabin to study it. The engineer, a man named Robert Fletcher, spent 3 days measuring temperatures, airflows, and solar radiation. He interviewed Heinrich extensively about the design and construction. Fletcher's report, published in 1880, was complimentary but cautious. He confirmed that Heinrich's cabin maintained comfortable temperatures with minimal fuel use. He explained the principles of thermal mass and insulation in technical terms, but he also noted the limitations. The design required a location with reliable winter sunshine. It required specific orientation. It required materials that might not be available everywhere. And it required construction skills beyond what most frontier settlers possessed. Still, Fletcher concluded that the basic principles were sound and could be adapted to various climates and conditions. He recommended further study and experimentation. The publication of Fletcher's report brought Heinrich some measure of fame. He was invited to speak at agricultural fairs and settler meetings. He was asked to consult on public buildings, schools, and churches. He politely declined most of these invitations. He was a stonemason and a farmer, not a lecturer or a consultant. He'd built his cabin to house his family, and he'd shared his knowledge freely with anyone who asked. That was enough, but Heinrich did write down his methods. In the winter of 1880, during the long evenings when his family was warm and comfortable in their cabin, he wrote a detailed manual explaining his design principles and construction techniques. The manual, written in both German and English, was 20 pages long and included drawings, measurements, and step-by-step instructions. He had copies made and distributed them for free to anyone who wanted one. The manual covered everything: how to orient the building for maximum solar gain, how to calculate the amount of thermal mass needed based on climate and building size, how to prepare and install grass insulation, how to build triple-glazed windows, how to create airlocks and minimize infiltration, how to design roof overhangs that shade summer sun while admitting winter sun. It was a comprehensive guide to passive solar building, written by a practical man based on real-world results. The manual spread widely through the frontier settlements. Copies were passed from hand to hand, recopied, and shared. The techniques it described influenced building practices throughout Nebraska and beyond. Some of the principles found their way into conventional building, even in structures that didn't follow Heinrich's extreme approach. Better insulation, attention to solar orientation, reduction of air leaks, these became more common as builders absorbed the lessons. Heinrich lived in his grass-walled cabin for 32 years. He raised his children there, saw them marry and start their own families. He expanded his farm, prospered, and became a respected elder in his community. His cabin never failed him. Winter after winter, it performed exactly as designed. The grass in the walls remained dry and functional. The stone walls continued to absorb and release heat. The structure required minimal maintenance, just occasional replastering of the interior sod walls and minor roof repairs. In 1908, at the age of 73, Heinrich Zimmermann passed away. His cabin was inherited by his youngest son, Wilhelm, who lived in it for another 15 years before building a larger, more modern house nearby. The original cabin was converted to storage, then gradually fell into disrepair. By 1930, it was abandoned. The roof partially collapsed. The walls, no longer maintained, began to deteriorate. In 1942, the remains of the cabin were dismantled. The stone was salvaged for other building projects. The sod walls, no longer protected by the roof, melted back into the prairie. The grass insulation, finally exposed to weather after 66 years, decomposed quickly. Within a few years, almost no trace remained of the structure that had once been famous throughout Nebraska. But the knowledge survived. Heinrich's manual, reprinted several times over the decades, remained in circulation. Agricultural colleges studied his techniques. The emerging field of passive solar design in the mid-20th century rediscovered many of the principles Heinrich had worked out through experimentation and intuition. Modern passive solar homes, with their south-facing glass, thermal mass, and heavy insulation, are direct descendants of Heinrich's grass-walled cabin. If you're enjoying this story of forgotten ingenuity and practical innovation from the American frontier, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss more stories about the clever solutions our ancestors developed to survive and thrive in challenging conditions. The technical principles behind Heinrich's cabin are worth examining in detail because they represent sophisticated understanding of heat transfer and energy storage. First, consider insulation. Heinrich understood that heat moves from warm to cold through three mechanisms: conduction, where heat travels through solid materials; convection, where heat is carried by moving air or liquid; and radiation, where heat travels as electromagnetic energy through space. His 7-foot thick walls addressed all three. Conduction was blocked by the grass and trapped air, which are poor conductors. Convection was eliminated by preventing air movement within the wall cavity. Radiation was less of a concern through opaque walls, but was addressed by the multiple layers of material. The effectiveness of his insulation can be quantified. Modern testing of similar materials shows that dry grass has an R value of approximately 3.5 per inch. Heinrich's 3-foot thick grass layer, 36 inches, would have an R value of roughly 126. The sod walls on each side would add additional R value. The total wall assembly probably achieved an R value exceeding 150. For comparison, a modern, well-insulated wall might have an R value of 20 to 30. A typical frontier log cabin wall had an R value of perhaps 5 to 8. Heinrich's walls were 15 to 30 times better insulated than a standard cabin. This meant that heat loss through the walls was reduced to a tiny fraction of normal. Second, consider thermal mass. The 6 tons of stone in Heinrich's south wall could store approximately 120,000 BTUs of heat for every 10 degrees Fahrenheit of temperature increase. If a sunny winter day heated the stone from 60 degrees to 90 degrees, a 30-degree increase, the stone would store approximately 360,000 BTUs. For reference, a human body at rest generates approximately 300 BTUs per hour. A family of 6 would generate about 1,800 BTUs per hour, or about 43,000 BTUs over a 24-hour period. This means the heat stored in the stone on a single sunny day could theoretically provide 8 times the heat loss from the family for an entire day. In practice, the cabin also lost heat through the windows, through air infiltration around the door, and through the floor and roof, despite their insulation. But even accounting for these losses, the thermal mass provided enough stored energy to maintain comfortable temperatures for several days between sunny periods. Third, consider passive solar gain. The south-facing windows, totaling about 18 square feet of glazing, captured sunlight whenever it was available. On a clear winter day in Nebraska, the solar radiation on a south-facing surface can exceed 2,000 BTUs per square foot. The 18 square feet of window could therefore capture over 36,000 BTUs per day, assuming reasonable transmission efficiency through the triple glazing. Not all of this energy would be effectively captured and stored. Some would be reflected, some would heat the air and be lost through ventilation, and some would overheat the space temporarily. But even if only 50% was effectively stored in the thermal mass, that's 18,000 BTUs per day from solar gain alone. Combined with the heat generated by the occupants and from cooking, this was enough to maintain comfortable temperatures despite the slow heat loss through the building envelope. The genius of Heinrich's design was in the integration of these elements. High insulation reduced heat loss. High thermal mass stored heat. Passive solar gain provided free heat input. The combination created a building that naturally maintained stable, comfortable temperatures with minimal additional energy input, but the design also had limitations. It required a climate with regular winter sunshine. In regions with prolonged cloudy periods, the thermal mass would eventually cool down, and backup heating would be necessary. It required proper orientation. A cabin facing the wrong direction wouldn't capture enough solar gain. It required open southern exposure. Trees or hills shading the south wall would ruin the solar gain. And it required careful construction. Poor workmanship, gaps in the insulation, Air leaks, wet insulation, or insufficient thermal mass would all compromise performance. Heinrich understood these limitations and was always careful to explain them. His design wasn't a universal solution. It was a site-specific, climate-appropriate solution that worked brilliantly in the right conditions. The legacy of Heinrich Zimmermann's cabin extends beyond the specific structure. It represents a broader principle, that buildings should be designed to work with natural energy flows, not against them. Modern architecture often ignores this principle, creating buildings that are entirely dependent on mechanical systems for heating and cooling. These buildings consume enormous amounts of energy and are vulnerable to system failures. Heinrich's approach was the opposite. He designed his building to be inherently comfortable, using the free energy available from the sun and the insulating properties of simple, natural materials. The building was resilient, requiring no external energy supply for heating. When modern, passive solar design emerged in the 1970s, driven by the energy crisis and environmental concerns, practitioners rediscovered many of Heinrich's principles. The trombe wall, a modern, passive solar design element consisting of a south-facing glass layer in front of a high thermal mass wall, is essentially a refinement of Heinrich's south-facing stone wall and windows. The concept of super-insulation, using very thick insulation to minimize heat loss, is the same principle Heinrich applied with his grass-stuffed double walls. The attention to airtightness and elimination of thermal bridges, critical in modern efficient building, was something Heinrich intuitively understood and addressed in his construction. In this sense, Heinrich was decades ahead of his time. He was practicing advanced building science in 1876, using materials and methods available on the frontier. He wasn't an engineer or an architect. He was a stonemason who observed, thought carefully, and applied logic to solve a problem. The cabin that everyone laughed at, the foolish, grass-stuffed walls that would never work, proved to be a sophisticated solution based on sound scientific principles. The mockery Heinrich endured was based on ignorance and the assumption that traditional methods were the only viable methods. His critics couldn't imagine that walls stuffed with grass could outperform a conventional cabin with a roaring fire. They couldn't conceive that sunshine, properly captured and stored, could heat a home in winter. Their failure of imagination led them to dismiss innovation, to laugh at what they didn't understand. Heinrich's vindication came not through argument, but through results. His cabin worked. It stayed warm. His family was comfortable. The evidence was undeniable. Eventually, even the harshest critics had to acknowledge that he'd been right. The lessons from this story are applicable beyond building design. They speak to the value of questioning assumptions, of thinking independently, of being willing to try unconventional solutions. They speak to the importance of understanding principles rather than blindly following tradition. They speak to the courage required to persist in the face of mockery and doubt. Heinrich Zimmermann built his grass-walled cabin despite the laughter of his neighbors. He trusted his own analysis, his own observations, and his own logic. He was willing to be wrong, but he was confident in his reasoning. When the cabin performed exactly as he'd predicted, he didn't gloat. He simply shared his knowledge, helping others to build better. This generosity of spirit, this willingness to freely share knowledge that could have been kept proprietary, is another important part of the story. Heinrich could have charged for consultations, sold his manual, profited from his innovation. Instead, he gave the information away. He believed that good ideas should spread, that everyone deserved the chance to live more comfortably and safely. In the modern world, we've forgotten much of this practical wisdom. We've become dependent on complex systems and expensive technologies. We assume that comfort requires high energy consumption. We build houses that are expensive to heat and cool, that require constant mechanical intervention to remain habitable. We've lost the understanding that buildings can be inherently comfortable if they're designed properly. Heinrich's cabin is a reminder that there are alternatives, that with careful thought, appropriate materials, and skillful construction, it's possible to create structures that are comfortable, efficient, and resilient. The specific techniques he used, grass insulation and massive stone walls, might not be practical in all contexts, but the principles are universal. Reduce heat loss through excellent insulation. Store energy in thermal mass. Capture free energy from the sun. Design for your specific climate and site. These principles work anywhere. Modern technology gives us advantages Heinrich didn't have. We have better glazing materials, more efficient insulation, computational tools for modeling heat flows. We can design passive buildings with even better performance than Heinrich achieved. But the fundamental approach, designing buildings to work with nature rather than depending entirely on mechanical systems, remains as relevant as ever. The story of Heinrich Zimmermann and his grass-walled cabin is ultimately a story about human ingenuity and the power of applied knowledge. It's about a man who saw a problem, thought deeply about solutions, and had the courage to try something different. It's about the triumph of evidence over assumption, of careful reasoning over conventional wisdom, and it's about the lasting value of ideas that solve real problems in elegant, sustainable ways. The cabin is gone, dissolved back into the prairie from which it was built, but the knowledge lives on. The manual Heinrich wrote is preserved in historical archives. His techniques influenced generations of builders, and his story continues to inspire people who believe that there are better ways to build, better ways to live, and better ways to work with the natural world rather than against it. Everyone laughed at the grass-stuffed walls. They laughed at the massive stone wall facing the sun. They laughed at the idea that a cabin could stay warm without firewood. But when winter came, and Heinrich's cabin sat at 72 degrees Fahrenheit while his neighbors shivered and burned their furniture, the laughter stopped. The grass-stuffed walls, dismissed as foolish, proved to be brilliant. The stone wall, called excessive, proved to be essential. The cabin, mocked as a fantasy, proved to be the most practical building in the settlement. Sometimes the person everyone calls a fool is simply the only one who's thought things through. Sometimes the idea everyone ridicules is the idea that will change everything. And sometimes the simplest materials, grass and stone and sunshine combined with understanding and skill, can create something that performs better than anyone imagined possible. Heinrich Zimmermann understood something fundamental. He understood that comfort doesn't require complexity, that efficiency doesn't require expensive technology, that a well-designed building, using simple principles and common materials, can outperform conventional structures while using a fraction of the resources. This understanding, born from observation and validated through experience, is his lasting gift. The grass-stuffed walls weren't a joke, they were genius. The cabin that hit 72 degrees Fahrenheit with zero firewood wasn't impossible. It was inevitable, once someone understood the principles and had the courage to apply them. Heinrich Zimmermann was that someone, and his story, the story of the cabin everyone laughed at, deserves to be remembered and celebrated. Before we wrap up, if you found this deep dive into frontier innovation fascinating and want to see more stories about the forgotten techniques and clever solutions from America's past, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. There are so many more incredible stories of ingenuity and survival to explore. Now, the practical applications of Heinrich's approach are still relevant today. Anyone building or renovating a home can benefit from understanding these principles. Maximize southern glazing in cold climates to capture solar heat. Use thermal mass, such as concrete, stone, or even water containers, to store that heat. Insulate heavily to prevent heat loss. Design for your specific climate and site conditions. Minimize air leaks. These strategies, combined with modern materials and techniques, can create homes that are dramatically more efficient than standard construction. Some modern builders are achieving near-zero energy consumption for heating and cooling by applying these principles rigorously. The passive house standard, originating in Germany, requires buildings to meet strict performance criteria for insulation, air tightness, and heat recovery. Passive houses can maintain comfortable temperatures with 90% less heating energy than conventional buildings. This is the same order of magnitude improvement that Heinrich achieved with his grass-walled cabin. The difference is that we now have standards, certification processes, and widespread acceptance of the principles. In Heinrich's time, he was a lone innovator. Today, thousands of buildings worldwide are built to similar standards. The journey from Heinrich's mocked cabin in 1876 Nebraska to modern high-performance buildings spans nearly 150 years. But the core ideas haven't changed. Reduce heat loss, store energy, use free energy sources. The execution has improved, the materials have advanced, and the understanding has deepened. But the fundamental approach remains the same. This suggests something important about knowledge. Good ideas don't expire. Sound principles remain sound regardless of the era. The physics of heat transfer, the properties of materials, the behavior of energy, these are timeless. What changes is our awareness and application of these principles. Heinrich Zimmermann, with no formal training in engineering or architecture, working with the materials available on the Nebraska prairie, figured out principles that were forgotten and had to be rediscovered a century later. His manual, written by lamplight in the winter of 1880, contained information that wouldn't become mainstream in building science until the 1970s. This is both inspiring and sobering. Inspiring because it shows what individual human intelligence and determination can achieve. Sobering because it shows how easily knowledge can be lost, how societies can forget important lessons and have to relearn them the hard way. The 20th century saw a massive shift in building practices, driven by cheap fossil fuels and the widespread availability of mechanical heating and cooling systems. Why bother with careful solar orientation when you can just turn up the thermostat? Why invest in expensive insulation when heating oil is cheap? Why worry about thermal mass when you have a furnace? These seemed like reasonable questions at the time. The result was a building stock that is enormously wasteful of energy, uncomfortable when mechanical systems fail, and environmentally destructive in its resource consumption. We built millions of structures that would have appalled Heinrich Zimmermann. Buildings that leak air like sieves, that have minimal insulation, that ignore solar orientation, that depend entirely on burning fuel for comfort. We convinced ourselves that this was progress. Now, facing climate change and resource constraints, we're realizing the mistake. We're trying to retrofit efficiency into buildings that were designed to be inefficient. We're trying to reduce energy consumption in structures that were built to consume energy. We're relearning the lessons that Heinrich tried to teach in 1876. This relearning is happening slowly, unevenly, and at great cost. But it is happening. Building codes are gradually becoming more stringent. Efficiency standards are rising. Awareness is growing. More builders are learning about passive solar design, about thermal mass, about proper insulation. More homeowners are demanding better performance. The market is slowly shifting toward buildings that make sense. But we still have a long way to go. The average new house in America today is far less efficient than Heinrich's cabin was. It uses vastly more energy for heating and cooling. It's more dependent on external energy sources. It's less resilient to power outages or fuel supply disruptions. By any rational measure, we've gone backward. This is a hard truth to acknowledge. We like to believe that progress is linear, that each generation builds on the achievements of the previous one, that we're always getting better. The story of Heinrich's cabin challenges that belief. It shows that progress is not guaranteed, that knowledge can be lost, that sometimes a frontier stonemason in 1876 understood building science better than most professional builders do today. What can we learn from this? First, Question assumptions. Just because everyone builds a certain way doesn't mean it's the best way. Heinrich questioned the assumption that cabins needed large fireplaces and constant fires. He asked, why? Is there a better way? That questioning led to innovation. Second, understand principles. Heinrich didn't just copy techniques, he understood why things worked. He understood heat transfer, thermal mass, and insulation. This deep understanding allowed him to design an integrated system that performed brilliantly. Surface-level knowledge isn't enough. You need to understand the underlying principles. Third, be willing to experiment. Heinrich took a risk. He invested significant time and resources in an unproven design. He could have been wrong. His cabin could have failed, and he would have looked foolish. But he believed in his analysis, and he was willing to test it. Without that willingness to experiment, innovation is impossible. Fourth, share knowledge freely. Heinrich's manual, distributed for free, spread his ideas far beyond what he could have achieved alone. His generosity multiplied his impact. In a world that increasingly treats knowledge as proprietary, as something to be monetized and controlled, Heinrich's approach seems almost radical. But it's a reminder that the free exchange of ideas benefits everyone. Fifth, respect evidence. When Heinrich's cabin performed as predicted, even his harshest critics had to acknowledge reality. The cabin was warm. The thermometer didn't lie. In our current era, where people often reject evidence that contradicts their beliefs, this seems like an important lesson. Reality doesn't care about our opinions. Evidence matters. These lessons extend beyond building. They apply to any field, any challenge, any situation where innovation is needed. Question assumptions. Understand principles. Experiment. Share knowledge. Respect evidence. These are the tools of progress. Heinrich Zimmermann used them to build a cabin that stayed at 72 degrees Fahrenheit with zero firewood, in an era when everyone said it was impossible. His success proves that impossible just means nobody's figured it out yet. The grass-stuffed walls that everyone laughed at were smarter than any of the neighbors' conventional cabins. The massive stone wall that seemed excessive was exactly what was needed. The whole design, dismissed as foolish, was based on sophisticated understanding of thermal dynamics. Heinrich was right. The laughers were wrong. Sometimes it's that simple. In 1876, on the Nebraska prairie, a German stonemason showed the world that there was a better way to build. Most of the world wasn't paying attention. They were too busy laughing. But a few people listened. A few people learned. A few people built their own grass-walled cabins and discovered that Heinrich was right. Those people were warmer, more comfortable, and safer than their neighbors. That's the reward for questioning assumptions and thinking independently. Not universal acclaim, not wealth, not fame, just better results, just comfort, just the quiet satisfaction of knowing you figured something out. Heinrich Zimmermann died in 1908, mostly forgotten outside his local community. He never became famous. He never got rich from his innovation. He never received awards or recognition from any official body. He just lived comfortably in the cabin he built, raised his family, worked his farm, and shared his knowledge with anyone who asked. That seems like a pretty good life. The cabin is gone. The man is gone. But the knowledge survives. And every time someone builds a passive solar home, every time someone uses thermal mass for heat storage, every time someone insulates heavily and designs for climate, they're echoing Heinrich's work. They're applying the principles he demonstrated in 1876. The grass-stuffed walls aren't laughable. They're brilliant. And the cabin that hit 72 degrees with zero firewood isn't impossible. It's just good design. That's the story. That's the lesson, and that's why Heinrich Zimmermann and his grass-walled cabin deserve to be remembered.